Good afternoon. I hope that by my affectionate categorization of Lilith as comrade, the title betrays that this paper will be monster positive. Right off the bat. This is a common stance within the field of monster theory, which essentially argues that we can surmise a lot about, let's say, a culture, society, religious group, occult order, political party, or individual by the monsters they fear and employ. Now, viewing monsters as cultural productions, studying monsters and their discursive or supposed material interactions with humans, this can allow us to interrogate why they're scary and to who, the ways in which they are utilized to patrol and actually enforce the borders of the social order, who delineates them as monsters in the first place, etc. In the Ashgate Companion to Monsters and the Monstrous, Asa Mittman notes, "The monster is trying to tell us something. Monster theory tries to listen." Now, monster theory has made, I would say, great strides so far in interrogating and analyzing the social functions of monsters. Specifically, a huge contribution of this field illuminates the discursive associations between the monster and a given marginalized or oppressed group, let's say. And then we can kind of use monster theory to provide us with the tools to then examine the materializations of these effects of monsterization, I would call it. For example, we have Harry M. Benshoff's seminal work, Monsters in the Closet, as well as the documentary The Celluloid Closet, which highlights the ways in which the monster and the homosexual, for instance, have been linked within cultural artifacts, discourses, and productions historically, thus perpetuating stigmas of queerphobia. So basically, monsters do indeed produce materialized real-life impact, and in this sense, monsters are very real. So, is the religiomythic demoness Lilith a monster? The majority of her cultural reception history would certainly suggest so. However, arguing yes or no is not my angle here. Rather, my answer to this question is, it depends on who you ask. What my research focuses on is not solely the ways in which Lilith as monster has been historically and discursively linked to queerness, thus, further perpetuating marginalization, but rather in pushing a bit further, I'm specifically interested in what happens when marginalized groups or individuals actually align with or embrace the monster. In fact, I think we all, or at least I do, have those monsters that we can empathize with, sympathize with, kind of advocate for, root for, or even on some level understand. And that probably says as much about us as individuals as does the monsters that we're afraid of. So in that sense, I think we can tell a lot more about a historical individual or group that embraces the monster or the monstrous in terms of their embodied experiences, subjectivities, or even material or artistic rebellions. This is a nuance that I believe monsters present us with, as well as a kind of current gap, I would say, within the field of monster theory. Now, in my ongoing PhD dissertation at the HHP in Amsterdam, I refer to this phenomena as stigmatized alignment, in which the marginalized kind of utilize or reclaim the monster to create subversive discourses and or practices and actions of resiliency and power. So today, I would like to present an example of one infernal collaboration between the denizen and the demonic by examining Lilith within the works of the 19th century lesbian pagan poet Renee Vivian. But first, to set the scene, I would like to provide some brief notes on the monster, monstrosity, and monster theory more generally. So what is a monster? Definitionally, I defer to Halpersam's 1995 Skin Shows, kind of arguing that monsters are meaning machines. Halberstam also kind of presents monsters as figures of a negative identity, arguing, quote, "Monsters have to be everything the human is not, And in producing the negative of the human, this makes way for the invention of human with a capital H as white, male, middle class, and heterosexual. Now, monsters take many forms and originate from numerous realms, and their origin stories is actually one of the contributing factors of the terror that monsters inspire within us. So you have devils and demons, monsters that live beyond this world, monsters of the past who are resurrected or immortal or come back with unfinished business, like mummies, ghosts, what have you. There are monsters of nature, like Nessie, and this kind of tickles that human fear that someday the earth might fight back against us. We have the monster within, so Gollum and Gollum/Smeagol, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we could say. There are monsters of our own making, such as the Frankenstein monster and all of the splintering cultural offshoots. And then the monster who is within this world, but still from the outside, the outcast. So here we have the witch, for example. In terms of why monsters scare us, generally, I would simplify the main reason to the monster's overall transgression, transcendence, or just utter disrespect of boundaries. So their physical appearance, let's say, is either dangerously deceiving, like the attractive Gary Oldman-looking vampires, or grotesque, monsters with wings, claws, leathery skin, snakes for hair. Monsters have abilities that we as humans cannot control, mimic, understand, or predict, such as, let's say, Satan, the religious monster who has the ability to tempt one from grace, or witches with their ability to manipulate time, human will, nature, etc. Monsters also engage in or influence culturally unacceptable behaviors. They don't conform to human institutions of law and order, science and reason, rationality, etc., and they are full of contradictions. So the vampire as the living dead, ghosts as there but not. And I would say that the monster's overall kind of mode of assailment towards us humans typically comes in two simplified tracks. So the external threat, the unknown other somewhere beyond us, or an internal threat, whether it's the threat of possession, or even in a Jungian sense, the repressed and terrifying parts within us. Now, Lilith has haunted alongside humanity for some 5,000 years, and I certainly do not have the time to get into the nuances of that kind of overall narrative. However, she does fall into numerous of these categories. So she is a monster from beyond this world as existing or originating from the infernal realm. She's also a monster of the past, coming to haunt sleeping men or murder human children as a kind of vengeance act from her time in the Garden of Eden. She's certainly an outcast figure, and she is full of numerous contradictions and transcends numerous boundaries, such as her as a succubus figure, seductive yet deadly. Her appearance usually kind of takes the narrativistic or mythic form that can often combine animal and human features. She has the power to fly, the power to possess. She's certainly an outcast, which we can see from numerous kind of centuries of different amulets or incantation bowls that literally cast her out. She is a threat to human reproduction by, mythically stealing men's sperm or endangering, again, human infants, etc. And again, I don't have time to get into her history as sometimes a legion of spirits, or a wind spirit, or her relation to the Babylonian Lamashtu or the Greek Lamia. But I kind of want to now just situate us within the 19th century, since this is where primarily my research on Lilith lies, because if one discourse or narrative, I think, has kind of majorly informed or kind of solidified Lilith's representations and understandings culturally from the 19th century onward, that would be the medieval Jewish midrashic text of the alphabet of Ben Sirah, which tells, the story of Lilith as Adam's first wife. Now, this was kind of the narrative of Lilith that was the most influential in 19th century representations or engagements with her. And, kind of the key narrative tropes from this text are, again, her as a danger to pregnant women, human infants, a seducer and danger to men and their vital life force, a mother of demons, but what I think is most important, as a defier of the creator of the social order, the benefactor of the social order, and then attempted angelic enforcers of the social order. So within kind of these tropes, the key themes that come out within 19th century discourses on Lilith is her as a murderous succubus, the anti-mother, unruly, dangerous, and a destroyer of the social order of, the time. Now, here are, some examples of cultural productions in the 19th century aligning Lilith with these kind of monstrous and vilifying themes, such as Remy de Gourmand's play Lilith, which writes of Lilith as originally being created to sexually satisfy God, but when she becomes too kind of sexually ravenous, he gives her to Satan, where the play is full of very rich demonic foreplay and intercourse, and the two of them pervert sex and love for the rest of time. We also have the poem Body's Beauty, which accompanies Dante Gabriel Rossetti's pretty famous painting Lady Lilith, in which Rossetti writes as Lilith as the anti-Eve and the seductress of men who seduces for the purpose of eventually strangling them with her beautiful seductive hair. Now, my dissertation research specifically examines the ways in which these representations of Lilith link or associate her with queerness, basically deploying Lilith as a specter of the 19th century demonic lesbian threat. While I don't have time to delve into that specific analysis today, just the trend that I'm trying to gesture to here is the use of Lilith as an embodiment of a perversely sexual, uncontrollable femme fatale. Now, circling back to monster theory, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's list of these 7 theses help us examine monsters and their functions. So in terms of 19th century representations of Lilith, we can certainly see how she aligns specifically with the first thesis. Her reception in the 19th century is tailored, or a tailored product of the cultural backdrop in which she haunts. And just to hit this first thesis home, I want to briefly invoke maybe a more common monster. We have, of course, the novella Carmilla, which tells of it's basically a homoerotic vampiric tale that also plays into that larger 19th century fear of the demonic lesbian threat, or the vampiric lesbian threat, let's say. But then you have the film Nosferatu, which certain monster theorists have argued kind of represents the tensions of sexual hunger and sexual appetite during the interwar period and a rise of fascism in Europe. And then you have my favorite vampire film, Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, but the cultural backdrop in which, well, actually, first I want to note that in this film in particular, I think we see Dracula as kind of being this more bisexual seducer, and blood in this film in particular is kind of, construed as poisonous and pathogenic. And this film obviously was produced against the cultural backdrop of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, in which the queer community, more specifically gay men, were monsterized as kind of this walking pathogenic class, or human monster. Then, in the 21st century, we have what happens when a Mormon gets a hold of the vampire narratives. And so we can really see how vampires, like the themes are the same, but the cultural backdrop really informs the monster. So all of a sudden, the vampire, via Edward Cullen, is the moral compass of this series. He is, the, I think, 18th or 19th century vampire who has to keep skirting off the sexual advances of his teenage girlfriend, a human Bella, who just really wants to, engage in some intercourse, and he, vampiric intercourse, and he maintains that they have to wait until they get married, etc. So the representation of Lilith that's cast then now in the 19th century by Rossetti, Gourmand, Hugo, and other kind of 19th century male creators, I kind of want to know, I think harkens back to the very etymological root of the word monster, coming from the Latin monstrum, related to the verb monere, if I'm saying that correctly, which means to warn. So Lilith essentially was presented as a threat to the 19th century fin de siècle expectations of femininity, female sexuality, and patriarchal control. Now, these male creators aside, regarding whether or not Lilith was a 19th century monster, I would again say it depends on who you ask. Because to Renee Vivian, Lilith presented an infernal comrade in which to collaborate with on behalf of lesbian subjectivities and kind of lesbian resistance. Asa Mittman, once again, states, monsters do a great deal of cultural work, but they don't do it nicely. However, for Vivian, who aggressively positioned herself both personally and poetically against men, God, marriage, childbirth, heterosexuality, and the mainstream kind of at large, likely found the monstrous mythos of Lilith and the threat she presented to men, institutions, etc., as quite nice. So Renee Vivian was kind of coined Sappho 1900, and she was a prolific poet of the fin de siècle of Paris. Now, the important thing to note is her poetry consistently centers around women, sanctifies lesbianism, attacks heterosexuality, men, and the patriarchy. I also want to note that a huge kind of theme within Vivian's poetry is a devotion to transformation. So she essentially endeavored upon what her biographer Carla J. called a poetic rescue mission. She turned evil women into heroines. She debunked androcentric accounts of history and myth, and she presented, villains or monsters such as Satan and Lilith as allies to humans, specifically lesbians. And further, even kind of transformed lesbian sex and eros in her poetry from a pathology to a divine embodiment. Now, another example of a monstrous female figure Vivian kind of subverted and sanctified is the witch. In her poem Education, after kind of, heralding the witch for her knowledge and powers, Vivian defends witches, saying they have a right to exist and to be born. Now, I don't think it's a far stretch to note that the isolation and vilification that was experienced by mythic witches also aligned with Vivian's embodied experience as an out lesbian. Even regardless of the fact that 19th century Paris was, relatively bohemian and open and accepting, etc. Taking into account her entire body of works, this kind of suffering and feeling like an outsider is a central and overt theme. Her poem, The Pillory, kind of states this, in which she describes herself in the position of Jesus on a cross, and unlike Jesus, who has unconditional love and consensually engages in this suffering, Renee Vivian has no sympathy for the masses who kind of torment her while she's on the cross, stating, silently, I learned to hate them. In another piece called I Threw Away My Flowers, she also heartbrokenly wrote, everywhere I go, I mutter, I do not belong here. Now, these passages are just a few examples of Vivian's overall feelings of ostracization, which is an essential component of her story for us to move forward and just wrap this up by discussing her utilization of Lilith in tandem with the concept of stigmatized alignment. Lilith is mentioned in 5 of Vivian's works. We are going to focus on the second one, Vivian's Litany of Hate, which I would argue was her primary lesbian manifesto and a battle cry to fellow Sapphics, but it also kind of solidified Lilith as a lesbian heroine. So for the interest of time, I'm gonna kind of just read a few of these lines. So she writes, hate unites us stronger than love. We hate laughter and the rhythm of the day. We hate the aggressive face of males. We hate crowds and the laws and the world. Like the voice of a beast with a deep sound, our rebellion echoes and roars. By now, we can assume our means women, because she's clearly pushing back on men and patriarchy here, but then she goes on to say, beloveds without lovers, wives without husbands, the dark breath of Lilith is within us. And I think that this kind of line suggests that she's specifically talking, the our, the we, that she's speaking to is fellow lesbians. And therefore kind of presenting the dark breath of Lilith as being a fortifying and inherent aspect of the lesbian kind of embodiment and experience. Now, returning to Cohen's theses, in the works of Renee Vivian, I believe that Lilith embodies the 7th thesis, the monster as being that stands at the threshold of becoming. Now, in his other writings about monsters, Cohen has noted that the monster presents liberatory horizons and utopic possibilities. Indeed, monsters do possess, knowledge that humans might not have access to, alternative modes of being, alternative modes of moving, and unknown emancipations even. Now, this evokes another etymological root of the word monster related to the verb monstrare, which means to show or reveal. Now, a poetic collaboration between a human who hated men, childbirth, marriage, heterosexuality, and mainstream religion, and a demon who mythically and historically enduringly kind of endangered, defied, and threatens to destroy all of the above, is of course artistically intuitive, I would say. However, in the Litany of Hate, in which Vivian is speaking to and rallying lesbians together kind of under the aim of rebellion and resiliency and also collaboration and camaraderie, the dark breath of Lilith is presented, again, as both an intrinsic and fortifying component of lesbianism itself. Now, Vivian's use here of Lilith as kind of this icon of perversity and an inspirational figure of resistance and rebellion, and a component of lesbianism, I argue, presents a case study of this kind of stigmatized alignment between the queer and Lilith, kind of also, of course, kind of represents a case study in a historical association between Lilith and queerness, but that's an adjacent conversation. I lastly just wanted to note that for fans of this kind of queer, lesbian, and demonic collaboration beyond the veil, the 19th century was not some singular blip on the demonic radar. The 20th century also contains numerous instances of this stigmatized alignment between Lilith and the queer community, also certainly Lilith and the feminist movement of the 20th century, in which Lilith kind of became this patriarchy-smashing feminist heroine. And also certainly we can see in these 21st century examples, whether it be a meme or an internet blog post, this kind of infernal collaboration between the queer and the monster, right now this monster being Lilith, is seemingly and hopefully, I personally hope, enduring. So again, I guess just to summarize my argument, Lilith is, of course, yes, a monster to some, but a comrade to others. Thank you.